There is one specific catalyst about financial markets that is about to happen relatively soon that most altcoin holders completely forgot about, because the last time this happened back in the 2021 cycle, it marked the bottom for altcoins and the start of altcoin season. We're going to take a look at exactly what that is, as well as where are altcoins right now, because you need to be looking out for this one trend. So I hope you guys stay tuned for the video, smash the like button, and of course, if you are new, make sure you subscribe. So the major catalyst that is happening in the next few months that was essentially confirmed by Jerome Powell is the end of quantitative tightening. Quantitative tightening is the Fed reducing its assets, reducing its balance sheets, essentially selling off assets and not buying back assets in the open market. Now, what they're going to be doing in the next few months is they're going to be ending that process. They're no longer going to be selling assets, which is good because that means that liquidity is not going to be as restrictive. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up yet again is because in the last cycle, in 2019, the Fed did something very similar, which really marked the bottom between altcoins versus Bitcoin. Because if we take a look at this chart and we zoom in at the spot where the Fed actually ended quantitative tightening, it happened in the month of September 2019. We have, a blatant arrow here showing that the Fed at that point in time decided to, stop quantitative tightening. And that was a major catalyst that made alts bottom against Bitcoin and move up upwards from this. Now, from that point on, from the Fed ending quantitative tightening all the way to before the COVID crash, alt versus Bitcoin rallied roughly 75%. And then, of course, we had the outlier being COVID, the black swan event that happened that pushed everything back down. But ultimately speaking, the Fed ending quantitative tightening was a very bullish catalyst for altcoins bottoming against Bitcoin, as well as rallying against Bitcoin. Now, as we just heard over the last week, we had Fed Jerome Powell basically say that they're going to be ready to stop quantitative tightening in the next few months. Nobody knows when that's going to happen, but that is obviously a bullish thing that's going to be happening for altcoins if history repeats itself and something similar happens to the 2019 time where the Fed stopped quantitative tightening. Now, in order to track what's happening with quantitative tightening, I urge you to go take a look at the Fed balance sheet. You can go on to Google, type Fed balance sheet, and you're going to get to this chart here. Now, if we go to quantitative tightening when it starts, very easy to see when it happens. It's when this line goes down. You can see that the balance sheet in millions of dollars that the Fed holds goes down because they are selling treasury assets. So as this started, it seems that it was in 2018. At the beginning of the year, they started selling assets all the way up until the month of September, where they actually stopped quantitative tightening and then they started rebuying some of these assets. So they did a little bit of quantitative easing here as we did have, the treasury balance going back up. And then we had the COVID crash, and then there was pure quantitative easing, a whole lot of liquidity coming into the markets because things were absolutely crashing. Now, even though the Fed is not going to be doing quantitative easing this time around because rates are still high, they would have to bring the rates practically back down to zero to then do quantitative easing, which is likely not going to happen. Well, obviously not going to happen, but the end of quantitative tightening itself is still a major catalyst because going back to this chart, we can see that the Fed has been selling treasury assets since roughly May of 2022. So it's been about 3+ years, 3.5 years of Fed having restrictive liquidity stance in their balance sheet, continuing to sell off assets. And that is, a huge catalyst that's going to essentially stop in the next few months. They're going to flatline their balance sheet. And as you remember, in 2017's bull market, we had no quantitative tightening and no quantitative easing. but we still had a major bull market for Bitcoin, for Ethereum, as well as altcoins. So that is going to be coming in the months to come. As I said, we don't have an exact date for when this is going to happen, but what we do know is that we're going to have Jerome Powell speaking on the 29th of October. We already know that there's likely to be 2 more rate cuts this year, one in late October and one in mid-December. But we're likely going to find out more about quantitative tightening, because if you think of it, a couple months from now brings us to the mid-December meeting, and who knows if that lines up with when the Fed stops quantitative tightening and potentially a bottom for alts against Bitcoin. Now, even though we're still seeing altcoins bleed against Bitcoin, Bitcoin dominance is continuing to go up. You have to continue monitoring Bitcoin's price with the 50-week moving average. That's going to be your tell-all sign whether or not Bitcoin is going to continue pushing upwards or not, and that is going to ultimately lead into Ethereum as well as into your alt. But right now, it feels like despair. Don't get me wrong, I'm in the markets with you guys, and if you look at the fear and greed index, it's just pure fear right now. If we look at this all-time chart, well, as I'm recording this video, which is, now midnight on October 17th, which is insane, I probably should go to bed, but we have here the fear and greed index at 22. And if we take a look at September 2019, when the Fed stopped quantitative tightening, well, if we go take a look at the fear and greed index right over here in 2019, we had, ranges of even 12. If you go back up here, it was around 30 or so. In late August, we had, massive fear as altcoins were all coming down and people were seeing despair. And there was no chance that people were, thinking that altcoins were going to rally, because looking at the chart that we had against, altcoins against Bitcoin, we had just faced massive drawdown for altcoins. If we go from, April of 2019 all the way to September, alt versus Bitcoin had gone down 60%, and individual alts were probably down, anywhere from 60 to 80%, even more in some cases, from the previous bull market top in 2017. So, of course, the sentiment was very, similar to what we're seeing right now, and which is why the fear and greed index was around, 10, 20 or so, just like what we are seeing right now. And again, time and time again, when you do have these mini altcoin season, as we've indicated before, depending on the narratives that are, doing well at the time, we are always seeing one similar thing. And that similarity is that we come into a mini rotation of whether it's a narrative that does well or altcoins rally for a few months. But we always come into, these green circles coming down from it, and we basically just pump right out of it and go back down, pump right out of it, go back down, and pump right out of it. We've not seen that major move yet. We've not seen that major rotation where altcoins ultimately have just steadily broken this macro downtrend, because, it's very evident that from the last peak of the bull market, we've only continued seeing altcoins bleeding against Bitcoin, making new all-time highs, Bitcoin dominance going back up. Ethereum is slowly but surely starting to see this, but alts are just absolutely nowhere to be found. But what we're waiting for, in my opinion, is that major catalyst, which could be this, quantitative tightening ending, marking the bottom of this chart here, potentially comes back down to 25 and then comes right back up as the Fed ends quantitative tightening. And as we go into lesser restrictive liquidity flows, that could be something that we could see happen in the next few months, potentially towards the end of the year when the Fed decides to end quantitative tightening. Now, what I wanted to also highlight here is that every time we go into these mini altcoin seasons, like we said, we always come into them as we've bottomed out on the relationship for, the better part of a few weeks or a few months. And if we take a look at individual altcoins together, you're going to get a sense of what the trend usually is before these mini altcoin seasons. And again, we can look at, the major altcoin season. You remember 2020 2020 or 2019, it was absolute despair for altcoins as they were making new lows, but that led us into that major altcoin season. So sentiment is very interesting. Going to October 2023, let's take a look at Ethereum. This is basically, us falling again against Bitcoin for alts. And if we take a look at the Ethereum chart for October 2023, well, it brings us right over in here. So you have, a month of August red, and it goes all the way to September red. You have a little bit of a pump towards the end of September, but then your first 2 weeks of August are red, and sentiment is basically at an all-time low here, because just a few months ago in April it was at 21.25, and by the second week of October you're at $1,500, and from the April highs you've lost a whopping 30%. And at that point in time, let me tell you, the excitement in crypto is just not there. People are thinking it's the absolute end. And then what happens is we have these pumps all the way into March of 2024, and going back to altcoins versus Bitcoin, it basically coincides all the way to this peak here. So perhaps this circle could be a little bit more extended like this, but it just goes to show that move from October 23rd to March 24th, you actually saw Ethereum do quite well. In the general sense of things, altcoins were rallying against Bitcoin, but before that entire move, you had a 30% drawdown, and people were definitely, not seeing this move coming. And then you have that pump. So you can do this with the same thing from, the November pump we just had last year. Coins did rally again very well during that time frame. If we go to October 2024, you can see Ethereum, was getting lows of 2,400. And by the end of it, it was almost breaking out, making new all-time highs at 4,100. But again, at this point in time, we were now back lower in terms of alts versus Bitcoin, lower than what we just had in October 2023. So it just goes to show that sentiment keeps on rotating, and every time we are at, very low sentiment, and every time that happens, there is likely a push back to the upside, which is what I'm expecting. And for this entire macro move to really stop, because as we've said, we've been bleeding against Bitcoin ever since the, bull market of 2021. It could be that ending of QT, which could likely bottom out altcoins against Bitcoin and send this into that altcoin season that we are all waiting for. Now, I did this with ETH. You could do this with any other coin. For example, let's take a look at AVAX. If we go back to, let's say, October of 2023, this is AVAX at $8.60. AVAX before in April was at $20. More than a 50% drawdown in the matter of a few months. If you were back there in 2023, AVAX at $21, and by October, it was down roughly 60%. Sub $10, you probably did not see a push to $60 or $50 on AVAX within the next few months. Probably not. You probably would have thought, AVAX is dead. And here we have, this major move all the way up to $50. So again, it goes to show that sentiment does really correlate to what we are seeing with these mini altcoin moves. But again, that quantitative tightening ending could be the major catalyst that we're all waiting for. And that is one of the reasons why I'm staying bullish on altcoins, understanding that from now until then, there could be more drawdown for altcoins, but I'm okay taking that risk because I've accumulated some positions from some of the lows back in April when Ethereum was at 1,500 and other altcoins were getting absolutely destroyed. So that's my current thesis for altcoins, and the big catalyst I think is going to have an impact on altcoins versus Bitcoin. And the other sign of life that we have is that Ethereum versus Bitcoin, or Ethereum dominance, has bottomed out at the exact same point in time where it had bottomed out in September of 2019 when quantitative tightening ended. So here we have ETH being the second largest cryptocurrency, bottoming out again at the same spot where quantitative tightening ended. And here again in April of 2025, we don't have quantitative tightening ending, but we have a lot of public companies and ETH ETFs that we didn't have back in the previous cycle. So of course, at one point in time, ETH, in my opinion, was going to bottom. It's a coincidence that it bottomed right at the same spot as quantitative tightening ending. But I do think, some of the catalysts from ETH being the public companies buying outright ETH or ETH ETFs has definitely helped. And for altcoins, we're still waiting for that catalyst, which we don't have. And we're still waiting for the bottom against Bitcoin that we still don't have. But if you look at ETH dominance, well, the dominance of the previous cycle went up all the way to 22.5%. Right now, we're at 13%. And if you look at the trajectory of ETH dominance in the last cycle, well, of course, it wasn't straight up. There are times, and a lot of times, where ETH dominance comes right back down. If we go from August all the way to, let's say, December, you have, drawdown of 30% for ETH dominance. If you go from February 1st all the way down to roughly March, you have another drawdown of 30% and so on and so forth. But macro speaking, it goes all the way up and it did reach 22%. And right now we're only at 13%. So again, I do think there's still upside to ETH, which is likely going to benefit altcoins. But all of that is only possible if Bitcoin continues to move upwards. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys today. That is one of the bigger catalysts I am expecting, because rates are probably already priced in, although it's likely going to have a bullish effect. We know they're coming. We know quantitative tightening is coming, but we just don't know when that is going to come. And if I leave you off with one thing, if we look at this chart here, which is a psychology of a market, if you overlay the total three, so altcoins versus Bitcoin, it gives you this. And right now, I'd be curious to know where you guys think we are for altcoins. Are we in, this phase leading up to disbelief, saying that this is a sucker's rally? Are we, past that? Let me know what you guys think, but it definitely goes and put things into perspective, because Bitcoin on one end is almost in the euphoric stage, in my opinion. ETH is going to get there and altcoins are going to follow suit in due time. But with that being said, that's what I wanted to share with you guys today. If you want to see what I am doing in the crypto space, we do have our premium Discord. It's the first link in the description below. There's still a lot of opportunities, even though we are not, in an altcoin season. There are specific narratives doing quite well. One of them being Zora and creator coins on Base. We're diving into that one. So check out the Discord if you want to see what I am doing, the research that we do, so on and so forth. But if not, make sure you subscribe, stay tuned with these videos, smash the like button. Thank you guys for the support, and I'll catch you guys in my next video. Peace.